We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the honourable member for Herbert.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Defence. Dan Kieran, who was awarded the Victoria Cross for his heroic actions in Afghanistan, has been forced to sell his medals due to the cost of living pressures. He said, quote, "The reason for getting rid of the medal is to look after my own family. It will afford the opportunity for schooling. Times are tough, things are hard, especially for a family of 5. Will the Deputy Prime Minister apologise to Dan for Albanese Labor government's policies which have led to his heartache and for so much heartache for all other Australians?"
Order. Give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, look, I thank the member for his question. I actually wasn't aware of that fact in relation to Dan Kieran, and that is a very sad set of affairs. And Dan Kieran is an Australian hero, and whatever is the physical place of those medals, nothing takes away the honour that has been bestowed upon Dan Kieran rightly, and the way in which our country should view him. What I would say in relation to the questions of cost of living is this. Since we've come to power, we have been utterly focused on the economy. We have come into here each and every day focused on the economy and focused on Australians in the challenges that they face in respect of cost of living. Now, we get that Australians are doing it tough. In the global pandemic and the aftermath of it, disrupted supply chains, global crises, what that has seen is inflation impacting countries around the world, and Australia's not been immune from that, which is why we have been utterly focused on that task at hand each and every day. The most significant thing that we have done is to fight inflation. And I remind the honourable member that inflation today is at a rate of half of that of what we inherited from those opposite. Because the truth is that what we inherited from those opposite was an absolute economic basket case. What we had was a Liberal government, no less, which gave this country $1 trillion of debt with nothing to show for it. Headline inflation when you left office, when those opposite left office, was at 6.1%. It is now half of that today. And the most important thing we've been doing is fighting inflation through prudent economic management, and that has seen us deliver 2 surpluses, something that those opposite never did, despite the fact that they promised to the Australian people that they would be delivering a surplus each and every year. They are out there printing mugs around their achievements before they had actually made them. What we've done is printed surpluses which have had an impact on reducing the inflation rate. In fighting inflation, that is now starting to succeed. And where we have spent money, it has been focused on the cost of living. Rental assistance, looking at ways in which we can have more affordable childcare, cheaper medicines, energy rebates, most of which you there opposed. So that is the record when it comes to the economy. We are focused on the economy. We are focused on Middle Australia. You are focused on everything else.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Kingsford Smith is warned. Member for Petrie is now warned. I'd like to hear from the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Communications. How is the Albanese Labor government working to support families to keep children safer on social media?
Call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, because the safety and mental health of our young people is paramount. The Albanese government is committed to ensuring that we make the environments where children live, learn and interact safer, and that includes digital environments. We're taking a whole-of-government approach to minimising the harms that come from children accessing content online that's not appropriate for them. The Prime Minister has committed to introducing legislation this year to enforce a minimum age for access to social media. Implementing this legislation will be informed by the age assurance trial funded in this year's budget. And the legislation is also being informed by engagement with National Cabinet, the Safety Commissioner and recent work by former Chief Justice Robert French. I acknowledge the Premiers of New South Wales and South Australia who have kicked off the Social Media Summit today in Sydney, and I will join them in Adelaide tomorrow. This legislation is one part of a comprehensive approach this government is taking to address online safety. The Attorney-General delivered legislation making it a criminal offence to share non-consensual, deepfake, sexually explicit material, and he is progressing important work to strengthen online privacy for children. The Social Services Minister and I have delivered an Australia-first dating app industry code to ensure the industry improves the safety of Australians using dating apps, especially women. And with the support of the Treasurer and the Finance Minister, the Albanese government quadrupled ongoing base funding for eSafety to ensure that they are equipped to respond to online harms. As Minister, Mr Speaker, I've amended the basic online safety expectations so that platforms must place the best interests of the child at the centre of their products and services. And I've also brought forward by a year the independent review of the Online Safety Act to ensure it's fit for purpose, and I expect to receive that report in coming weeks. Mr Speaker, collaboration and cooperation within and across governments is the best approach to making digital environments safer. As we navigate solutions for parents, we're applying these principles to our social media age limits legislation. And we're also engaging with experts and advocates around the unintended consequences that young people may experience through this reform. Let me reassure the House, our approach is not about punishing young people or letting big tech off the hook. We all have a role to play. Social media services must act to address the impacts of their content on their platforms and how they affect young people. Platforms have shown they're capable of doing more, and we welcome their efforts to make services safer. But the Albanese government is determined to do our share to make digital environments safer for all Australians.
Give a call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to the allegations that were made today by the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Prime Minister. Under the Ministerial Code of Conduct, ministers have an obligation to, quote, demonstrate and uphold the highest workplace standards, including maintaining a safe and respectful workplace for their staff. Is the Deputy Prime Minister satisfied that he has complied with his obligations under the Code?
Give a call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for her question. And given what's happened, it's an important question to be asked. The short answer to the question is I am satisfied, but I would like to say this. Joe Ternowski first started working with me as my Chief of Staff when I was the Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs back in 2012. Joe is a person that I've known, therefore, for a long time. And she is a wonderful person. In her role then and in her role now, she has given me great service, and I remain deeply grateful for that. Jo is a person who is completely committed to social justice in this country, and I very much admire her for that. And given all of that, I mean, it's to state the obvious that in this moment I feel deeply sad that events have got to where they have. This is obviously very difficult. Now, let me say that in the way in which I've tried to manage this, I have done so with Jo's welfare in mind at every moment, as I would try to manage things on that basis for all of my staff. As is evident, this matter is now in the hands of lawyers, and of course that is absolutely Jo's right. But it does mean that it is very difficult for me to say anything more on this issue.
Give a call to the honourable member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government future-proofing the NBN after a decade of mismanagement by making it more affordable and accessible for all Australians?
Give a call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for her question. In April of 2009, more than 15 years ago, the Rudd Labor government established the National Broadband Network, and we understood back then that fast, reliable, universal broadband would go a long way to defining Australia's economic potential. The ability to transfer large amounts of data, detailed architectural drawing, medical imaging, complex computer modelling in real time was the future. And while we did not imagine the advent of artificial intelligence, we did understand back then that there would be future technologies which would require increased data, and that this form of connection would be at the centre of the way of life in the 21st century. And there was something deeply democratic about the National Broadband Network, particularly for a country which has most of its population in large cities, because for the first time it was now possible to do businesses in places like Toowoomba or Orange or Geelong, which had previously only been able to be undertaken in places like Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. Now, at the heart of this was fibre optic cable, and when those opposite came to power, they swept that aside and they doubled down on copper, and in the process they doubled down on the past. To be clear, the ability to transfer data by copper was first patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1881. And the limitations of their imagination when it came to the National Broadband Network was completely encapsulated by Tony Abbott when he said, and I quote, "Do we really want to invest $50 billion of hard-earned taxpayers' money in what is essentially a video entertainment system?" This blinkered, this dogged commitment to the past remains writ large on the faces of all of those opposite. And just like with Telstra, we know that those opposite want to privatise the NBN. Well, as a result of the legislation that was put into this parliament this week, this side of the House has guaranteed that there will be universal access for all Australians to the NBN forever. So while those opposite have their gaze fixed on the 19th century, the Albanese government is committed to walking Australia confidently into the future with a modern, with a reliable, with a first-rate, publicly owned NBN.
Before I call the honourable member for Wentworth, I'm pleased to advise the House that joining us today is His Excellency Mr Gabriel Vicenten, the Ambassador of the European Union to Australia. We have students from Bright, Wandalingong and Harriet Bell from the electorate of Indi joining us today. Hope I got that right, member for Indi. And also Mr Mark Robertson, the retiring member for Udjeri from the Queensland State Parliament. But I am also pleased to inform members that present in the gallery today is a delegation from the Republic of Fiji, led by the Deputy Prime Minister, the Honourable Manoa Kamete Kameta. They are joined by His Excellency Mr Ewan McDonald, the High Commissioner for Australia to Fiji, and are here in Parliament today on Fiji Day. We are privileged to share this day together in Australia as Vuvale, which means family, reinforcing the deep respect of our relationship. Welcome to you all. And on indulgence, I call the Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I join you in welcoming the Honourable Manoa Kameta, the Deputy Prime Minister of Fiji, and his delegation. To have Deputy Prime Minister Kameta with us in this place, where 1 year ago Prime Ministers renewed and elevated a Vuvale partnership, is really a distinct honour. In the past year, we've had significantly progressed shared priorities, including economic recovery, security and climate resilience, and deepened the strong personal ties our two governments have formed. I'd also like to recognise the exemplary role that Fiji plays in our Pacific region. We are deeply grateful for that. Australia and Fiji share an interest in strong regional architecture and a desire to work through the Pacific Islands Forum in the Pacific way on our shared challenges.
And on indulgence, the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I join in support of the Deputy Prime Minister's kind words to our most honoured guest. I also welcome His Excellency Ewan McDonald, the High Commissioner for Australia to Fiji and Special Envoy for the Pacific and Regional Affairs. He does a fantastic job in our country's name. Deputy Prime Minister, as you know, this is a long and abiding relationship, and we're very grateful for your presence here today. More than ever, the relationship is important, and the government and the opposition stand as one in our support of the bilateral relationship and ways in which we can work with you in the PIF and in other bilateral ways. The only exception to that, I suppose, is rugby, where you give us a touch-up now and again. But quite apart from that, there is no tension within the relationship whatsoever, and we hope that you enjoy a most fruitful stay here in Australia, and we thank you so much for making the effort to be here.
I'll give a call to the honourable member for Wentworth.
My question is for the Treasurer. E61 research has shown that young, innovative firms drive productivity, yet Australia's early-stage investment per capita is roughly a third of the US and a bit over half the UK's. And I'm concerned we aren't going to close this gap. We know that large super funds have actually halved their allocation to venture capital over the last 10 years, and the taxation of unrealised gains is going to make it harder for those investments from super. So how will the government drive private capital towards the most innovative businesses that can drive Australia's next productivity boom?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Wentworth for her question and for her interest, and also for the earlier opportunities to talk about some of these really important issues. I'll go to the specific first and then the general. When it comes to the superannuation changes before the Parliament, before the Senate, these are all about making sure that there are still generous tax concessions for people in the superannuation system, but slightly less generous for people with the biggest balances. The honourable member knows that, and we've discussed it at length in this Parliament as well. As part of a lot of consultation that we've done over quite a long period now when it comes to the superannuation tax concessions, and I salute the Assistant Treasurer for his work on this as well. One of the things that we have discovered, and one of the things that we understand, is that the categories that measure venture capital in superannuation, there is only a very, very small sliver of venture capital in self-managed super funds. For example, if you think about the most recent comparison, a couple of years old now, listed assets are about 30%, but the sorts of categories that VC gets captured in is about 3%. And so a tiny sliver. And I think, in fairness to the honourable member, she also acknowledged in her question that the challenge of VC funding and capital flows when it comes to VC, and the Industry Minister has raised this in different ways in our forums as well, that's been a longer-term challenge and a longer-term trend which is completely unrelated to the changes that we are proposing to super. But it is a challenge. It is a challenge. And I acknowledge the concerns that the member raises and that others have raised about VC. One of the reasons why, when we first came to office, amongst all of the opportunities you have to put together different groups to help advise us externally on government policy, one of the most important things we did is we put together the Treasurer's Investor Roundtable. And that is all about trying to grapple with some of these challenges we have with capital flows in our economy. You know, our Future Made in Australia agenda, our agenda around superannuation, what we're trying to do in housing and the clean energy transformation and some of the other big beneficial shifts in our economy. A lot of what we're trying to do is about trying to get those capital flows right. But for some of these especially difficult challenges, the Investor Roundtable, which brings together trillions of dollars of capital around a table to advise us on how we nut out and grapple with and solve some of these issues, that's been a really important forum. Not because we have fixed every issue that the honourable member rightly raises, but because we know that we give ourselves a much better chance of addressing those issues if we work together with people inside and outside the Parliament. And in that regard, I welcome and encourage the great work of E61.
We call to the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. Minister, what has been the community's response to the government's commitment to keep the national broadband network in public ownership? And why is the government committed to providing affordable, accessible, high-speed broadband for Australians? And what are the alternative positions that have been proposed?
We call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. I know she is pleased that more than 10,000 homes and businesses in Alice Springs can now order a full fibre upgrade on the NBN thanks to strong investment under the Albanese government. Mr Speaker, Labor founded the National Broadband Network to provide fast, reliable and affordable broadband to all Australians, irrespective of where they live. And only by keeping the NBN in public ownership can that vision continue to be delivered. But, Mr Speaker, it's not just the government that supports this policy. The regions support it. Mayor Ken Anderson from the Flinders Ranges Council said, "I support the Australian government in keeping the NBN in public ownership. I think it is more than fair to say that privatisation of essential services does no favours for regional South Australia." Mr Speaker, consumers support it. ACAN's CEO Carol Bennett said, "Retaining public ownership of this critical public asset will provide the opportunity for continued improvement in the communications services Australians need now and into the future." The workers support it. Shane Murphy, CW National President, said, "NBN workers and their families will also breathe a sigh of relief, knowing their jobs won't be on the chopping block because of privatisation." The industry supports it. Optus interim CEO Michael Venter said, "Optus welcomes the federal government's legislation to keep the NBN in public hands. Keeping this critical asset under government ownership is likely to be the best approach for Australian consumers and will also provide a welcome level of ongoing certainty to the sector." Mr Speaker, the Albanese government's position on the NBN is crystal clear. It is not for sale. In 2021, we made an election commitment to retain the NBN in public ownership, to keep broadband affordable and to complete building a world-class fibre network. And, Mr Speaker, in 2022, we formalised this commitment in a new statement of expectations for the NBN. And yesterday, we introduced legislation to enshrine this position in law. Mr Speaker, the opposition's had 3 years to give their position on the NBN and to answer a simple question. Will you preserve the NBN in public ownership or will you flog it off? And yesterday they finally revealed their hand when a Liberal MP confirmed that privatisation was always part of their plan. When asked whether the NBN should be privatised, the answer was, "It has always been in the contemplation that it will be privatised." Australians have a clear choice, Mr Speaker, to keep the NBN in public ownership or, under those opposite, have it flogged off.
Has concluded. The member for Latrobe. Order. Right here from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to the allegations that were made today by the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Prime Minister. When did the Deputy Prime Minister first speak with the Prime Minister or his office about the allegations of bullying within the Deputy Prime Minister's office?
We call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and again I thank you for the question. As I referred to in my previous answer, I'm limited in how much we can now talk about this, given that this is in the hands of lawyers. But in answer to your question specifically, what I can say is that it is evident now on the record that I've been working with the Prime Minister's office for months in respect of this matter, and the Prime Minister has been made aware of this.
We call to the member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to ensure more competitive, dynamic economy and get fairer prices for Australians? How does this compare to alternative policies?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Because the member for Holt's such a good local member, she understands that we need to engage in this fight against inflation on every front that we can. We need to provide as much help as we responsibly and meaningfully can to people who are doing it tough, whether it's in her community or communities represented by all honourable members in this place. And that's why our cost of living relief is so important, but it's also why it's so important that we do what we can to make our economy more competitive, because a more competitive economy is an economy which is fairer for consumers and was also ultimately a stronger economy. And that's why it's so important that I was able to introduce to the parliament today, and I acknowledge the work of the Assistant Minister Lee in putting together the legislation before the House, which represents the biggest change to our mergers regime in around half a century. It is a really important economic reform. It is a total overhaul of our mergers regime, and it will help make our economy more competitive, more dynamic and more productive as a consequence. The current system of merger approvals is too slow and too many mergers slip through the cracks, and these reforms will make the system stronger, faster, simpler, more targeted and more transparent. It's all about approving the good mergers faster, recognising that many are good, but also catching the damaging ones where we can. And this means more competition for consumers and more certainty and more clarity for business at the same time. I want to acknowledge here the really quite outstanding work of the ACCC Chair, Gina Cass-Gottlieb, who was at the press conference this morning reminding people that these were the sorts of changes that the ACCC itself has sought so that they can do their really important work when it comes to merger approvals.
Leader of the Nationals.
Now, in addition to the monetary thresholds that we also announced today, they're set by regulation, but we announced them today, we also made it really clear that there are some sectors of our economy which warrant particular attention, and one of those, obviously, is supermarkets. We know, and the honourable member knows, that a lot of the cost of living pressures that people feel, they feel at the checkout. And so we want to make sure that the supermarket sector is as competitive as it can be, and that means that I have determined that every supermarket merger will be screened under these new arrangements. Not just the ones caught automatically by the monetary thresholds, but all of the supermarket mergers that are proposed will be screened. And that's because we do understand that in order to make our economy more competitive, there are some sectors which are more sensitive than others. Supermarkets are an obvious candidate. Not the only thing we're doing when it comes to competition policy, but a really important part of it.
Has concluded. The call to the member for Hughes.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Communications. Minister, I refer to the June 2023 report prepared by the late Peter Murphy, a report I signed concerning online gambling restrictions. In December 2023, the minister said she would ensure a policy would be resolved, quote, expeditiously and would be announced, quote, without delay. It is now October 2024 and the government still has not arrived at a policy. With which elements of the Murphy report does the minister disagree?
Call to the Minister for Communications.
Well, I thank the member for her question. I acknowledge her interest in this matter, as I'm sure all members of this place are concerned about the harms that occur when it comes to wagering in certain contexts. Of course, we understand, given the high level of community concern here and the fact that Australians lose some $25 billion every year in response to gambling, that this is an area in which improvements need to be made. So I commend the member for her work on that committee and all members of this place who worked on that committee report. There are three things I'll say to the member. The first is that this is a report that set out some 30 recommendations, many of which go to the interaction between Commonwealth and state governments and their regulatory arrangements. So we're working carefully through those with the states and I'm doing that in conjunction with a number of other ministers, including the Minister for Social Services. It is a complex area in that respect. It's complex because there are certain regulatory arrangements that the states obviously have a keen interest in, but it's one where, of course, the Commonwealth wants to ensure that we have the most robust response when it comes to dealing with wagering harms. The second point is, of course, we know that given the high level of gambling harms, not only in terms of economic but social consequence, that we need changes that not only go to regulation and to law, but also go to cultural change. And the way in which we are seeking to achieve that is threefold. The first is breaking the nexus between sport and wagering. Second, it's concentrating on the exposure of children to gambling harms. But thirdly, it's also addressing the saturation of ads, particularly as they are targeted towards young men aged around 18 to 35.
The Minister will pause, and I'll hear from the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Speaker. I take a point of order on relevance. This was a question particularly directed at the Murphy report, and I'd say that the Minister is not being directly relevant to what she disagrees with within that report.
The member for Hughes is entitled to raise a point of order. She's done so. I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Just to the point of order, Mr Speaker. The question it was quite a long question, and obviously the Murphy report involves a large assessment of a whole lot of issues on this topic area. And so by virtue of what was just raised, with it being with respect to the Murphy report, that is in fact why the topic area is so wide.
I'll just make sure that the Minister in her answer is referring to either the recommendations or the topic of the report. I don't know what is every recommendation, I'll be honest with everyone, but I need to make sure that she's within the standing orders. She just can't talk about the broad subject topic. She was asked a specific question by the member for Hughes about the recommendations, and I'll just make sure that she's being directly relevant and that her answer continues in that way.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The recommendations go to two areas. The first is in terms of reductions in gambling harms, and secondly, the way in which they can actually be implemented. The point that I'm making to the honourable member, and I know that she asked this question from a good place, is that we need to understand, but we also need to ensure that the impacts in responding to this report actually achieve their desired outcomes. And to give some example of that, the need to be forward-looking and comprehensive in this response necessitates a response that is really not only whole of government, but is whole of nation as well. We're doing this through looking at areas where exposure might not be prevalent yet, but could be in future, and we're also looking at areas in which we need to ensure that there is strong legislative response from the outset. So these are complex areas. We're determined to make a difference, and the status quo, particularly in relation to advertising, is unacceptable.
Give the call to the honourable member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. How is the Albanese Labor government's paid family and domestic violence leave making a difference to Australians?
Give the call to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment and the Minister for Workplace Relations.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Corangamite. We often refer to individual members for their commitment or association with an issue. The member for Corangamite is able to, with respect to paid family and domestic violence leave, have the status of having been the first employer in the world when she was Mayor of South Coast to have established this as a workplace right. 2 years ago, this parliament as a whole did a really good thing. It was world-leading legislation that we voted on. There'd been arguments about how soon we could get there. There were arguments about amendments, but ultimately when we got to the final question as to whether we should take this step, the parliament voted together in this place and in the other place. And effectively what we decided was a very simple principle, that nobody should have to choose between safety and pay. That's the principle of family and domestic violence leave. As part of the legislation we put through, there was a requirement that there would be a formal review That review, 2 years later, has been conducted and is in. The program itself has been so far extraordinarily successful. Fears that some had that it may actually be, there might be abuse of it, that it wasn't being used properly, have not been well founded. But where it has been used, it has been life-changing. Now, one of the decisions that we took was unusual for a leave decision. Normally, paid leave is something that only applies to somebody who is in permanent employment, be they a full-time or a part-time employee. But of course, there are a number of characteristics for people who experience family and domestic violence. They are more likely to be women, and women experiencing family and domestic violence are more likely to be casuals. So we took the unusual step to have this as a leave entitlement that would apply to casuals. I just want to give one very simple case study that's appeared in the review that has been brought down as a result of the legislation that we passed. A casual at a discount department store accessed family and domestic violence leave to leave a relationship, and she accessed it again at a point where her former partner tried to re-enter her life. As a result of having the leave available, she was able to organise temporary accommodation. She was able to spend time finding care for her children, and at no point did she have to compromise her capacity to pay her bills. That is exactly the scenario that we wanted. This is a leave entitlement that in an ideal world would never be required. But in the world in which we live, where we know that this will be the experience of far too many Australians, and in particular far too many women, if we as a parliament can do as we have done and make sure that those who experience this don't have to choose between safety and pay, then we've truly done a good thing.
With the call to the honourable member for Menzies.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. Minister, it has been 470 days since the late Peter Murphy's report was tabled concerning online restrictions for gambling. Along with the member for Hughes, Cowper and many others in this place, I too signed that report. Australian parents are expecting the government to deliver on its promise of reform. Will the government make a decision this month?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
I thank the member for his question and again acknowledge his work and the fact that this is obviously an issue which impacts many people in all of our communities. The government is committed to responding comprehensively to the Murphy report. I have put on the record, and as have other ministers, that it is our strong intention to be able to deliver on that this year. We are working towards that. As I said, it is a complex area. I would point out, for the member's benefit, that under the previous government, of which he was not a member, he may not be aware that there was tinkering with the rules around advertising of broadcast of wagering, and it actually resulted, under the former government, in an increase in advertising, an increase, especially on regional TV. There was no comprehensive response that was provided. So we are very determined, Mr Speaker, to ensure that the response that we have covers whole of government, goes to all of the recommendations in the Murphy report, and actually delivers not only legislative and regulatory but cultural change. We are committed to achieving this, and I'm sure all like-minded members of this House are committed in achieving this. And I look forward to working with the honourable member to ensure that this comes to fruition.
Give the call to the honourable member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. After a decade of cuts and neglect, how are Medicare urgent care clinics making it easier for Australians to see a doctor and taking pressure off hospital emergency departments?
Call to the honourable member to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to my friend, the member for Macon, for that question. A big part of our promise to strengthen Medicare, Mr Speaker, from Labor was to introduce a network of urgent care clinics. And they would be open 7 days a week, extended hours and available for walk-in appointments. We promised to open 50 last year, Mr Speaker, and we opened 58. We'll open another 29 this year as a result of the strengthening Medicare agreement the Prime Minister struck with premiers last December. And this week, Mr Speaker, we will pass 800,000 patients being seen since the clinic started to open last June. A third of them kids under 15, a third of patients seen on the weekend, and every single patient, Mr Speaker, importantly for Labor, every single one fully bulk billed. Now, last week, I was delighted to join the member for Macon to open clinic number 76, the Para Hills Medicare Urgent Care Clinic. Now, more patients in his community will be able to get the urgent care that they need when and where they need it, taking real pressure off those local hospitals, Modbury and Lyell McEwen and their emergency departments in particular, Mr Speaker. And the local clinical director, Dr Monkhouse, who joined the member for Macon and I, said this to the press, Mr Speaker. He said, "I'd just like to thank the current federal government for actually breaking the mould and doing something. There is a massive problem with patient visits to emergency rooms, and somebody has at last put their hand up, stepped up to the plate and done something about it, Mr Speaker." And I thank Dr Monkhouse for that. Once the network of 89 clinics is fully up and running, Mr Speaker, they'll see as many as 1.5 million patients every single year, most of whom would otherwise have turned up at the local emergency department. And already, with only some of those clinics open, we know that presentations for non-urgent conditions at the emergency departments of the 3 big states on the eastern coast are either flat or are actually trending down, confirming that these clinics aren't just good for patients and parents, they're also good for our hospitals, Mr Speaker. Along with rising rates of bulk billing and cheaper medicines, these clinics are making a real difference to millions of Australians, Mr Speaker, but we know it's still tough and we know we have to do more. But we also know that all of this progress, Mr Speaker, is under threat from those opposite. The Shadow Treasurer in particular could not have been clearer that Labor's investment to strengthen Medicare are all on the chopping block under a Dutton government. We know this. He could not have said it more clearly. The funding will be cut. The clinics will close, the patients will be forced back into the emergency department, and if you think it can't be true, Mr Speaker, just look at what the Leader of the Opposition did last time he got his hands on Medicare.
Order. Give the call to the honourable member for Indi.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. The government's aged care reforms include changes to home care support, but people in rural areas of my electorate of Indi are concerned their packages will continue to be chewed up by provider travel costs, reducing the services they actually receive. How will you ensure regional and rural Australians won't be disadvantaged by the travel costs of delivering support at home?
Call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Indi for her question and for her ongoing dedication to making sure that we do improve aged care, particularly in the regions, but for everybody, lifting the standard across the country. We are acutely aware of the challenges facing providing quality care and better care to people in the regions, and that's why, like you talk about, the new Support at Home program that is due to come in 1 July next year represents $4.3 billion worth of investment in new money for the sector to make sure that we can deliver better and higher quality services. One of the features of Support at Home is that pricing and what pricing looks like for everybody, no matter where they live, will be determined by IHACPA, which is the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority. So that should give both providers and people needing care in your area some reassurance that there is an independent eye looking at this and advising the government on what those prices should be. So we will be looking at that advice. We are required to table it in the parliament. It's very transparent, so you will be able to see it too, and that will dictate what we offer by way of services and how much those services need to cost. I'd add, by way of additional relevant information, that we provided, I think it's more than $600 million worth of services for providers in thin markets, which most frequently affect people in rural, regional and remote areas. That's $600 worth of measures, specifically acknowledging the fact that, like you say, people in the regions have particular challenges that we need to address as a federal government when giving them aged care. Support at Home more generally will assist more than 300,000 participants in the next 10 years. It's the most transformational reform that this sector has seen and will see in 30 years. It will help with shorter wait times for people who are waiting for these services. We know that we need to get those wait times down. It will give more tailored support, so people that you're talking about at the moment who are on home care packages, who use things like transport services, they'll move to 8 different permanent levels, which will better acknowledge the challenges that people face and the services that they need to receive as they stay at home for longer. There'll be support for home modifications, so up to $15,000 for people in homes in your electorate to put ramps in, to modify their bathrooms so that they can actually stay at home rather than needing to go into residential aged care. There's also better transit arrangements, so if you have a fall, we're going to uplift the allied health supports that you can receive both before going into hospital or coming out of hospital, so that you and your family aren't positioned in hospital having to make a decision about going into residential aged care purely because there's nothing to help you in the 3 to 6 weeks you need, where you need that extra support before you can go back to kind of normal living at home. So all in all, I'm on the case, and IHACPA will help regulate that pricing, particularly with respect to transport services.
Give the call to the member for Cunningham.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education. How is the Albanese Labor government helping to ease cost of living pressures for early childhood education and care workers?
Call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education and the Minister for Youth.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Cunningham for her question. And it wasn't that long ago that I was in Cunningham with the member, where we visited Kids Uni at the University of Wollongong. And what a great opportunity it is whenever we visit early childhood education centres, whether it's in Swan or Reed or Bendigo or Robertson or Boothby, to have that opportunity to interact with early childhood education workers and with the children, and to see firsthand the vital job that early childhood educators do in supporting and educating our children's early learning and development in those very first 5 years of a child's life, where 95% of their brain development is occurring. But they also make it possible for millions of Australians to do their jobs, to take on extra hours, to take on extra study or volunteer work if they so wish. And that's why we are recognising the value of the work done by early childhood education workers and helping to ease the cost of living pressures for them by getting wages up through an historic 15% wage rise. Because we know that if we are to achieve that vision of universal early learning for every child right across Australia, we have to start with a strong, sustainable workforce. And I'm pleased to say, Mr Speaker, that early learning providers can now apply for the government funding to deliver early childhood education workers this historic pay rise. What this pay rise means is that 200,000 early childhood workers right across Australia will have at least $100 a week more in their pay packets by Christmas, just in time for Christmas. And by the end of next year, that's going to be more than $150 extra in their pay packet. Now, Gemma, a passionate educator from Melbourne, said this. She said this is what it means to her. She said, "It means we are acknowledged for the work that we do day in, day out. It means we can stay in our jobs and not live paycheck to paycheck. And it means we can build that strong and stable early learning workforce that we need." And Lisa, another educator from New South Wales, she said this to me. She used these words. She said, "This is monumental, a history-making moment. It means I can stay in the job I love. I know it's going to change a lot of lives and not just my own." Now, along with our government's tax cuts, early learning workers will now be able to earn more and to keep more of what they earn. Mr Speaker, the Albanese Labor government is delivering real cost of living relief for Australian workers and for their household budgets.
Call to the member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development and Local Government. Minister, after almost 2.5 years in government, how many Growing Regions Fund projects have been contracted, allowing local councils to actually start work?
Call to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for the question.
a very important question because we had a lot of work to do coming into government, cleaning up botched regional grant programs. We had regional grants given to the North Sydney pool. And I'm not sure where the member for Gippsland was there, because I'm not sure how many members of your community, because certainly none of mine, see North Sydney as a regional pool.
Just the minister's
it's really important.
The minister's going to pause. Member for Page, member for the Leader of the Nationals, the member for Gippsland is going to cease interjecting. The minister was asked a specific question about a grants program. She's had a 30-second preamble. She's going to have to return back to the question. And to assist the House, we're just going to cease the level of interjections. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, we've had a big job to do in cleaning up grants programs across Parliament. What we've done is put in place transparent grant mechanisms for the first time in a very long time. We've had a multi-party panel that has assessed those grants. We've announced successful grants through round one, and we are working with those successful applicants.
Order. The minister is referring to round one of the grant application, so she is being directly relevant. So it will be difficult. I can appreciate the member is looking for a number.
Thank you, Speaker.
Don't need to take point of order. I heard that loud and clear. But under the standing orders, the minister can talk about the program, and I've already brought her back to relevance. So I'll hear your point of order.
Well, Speaker, the point of order was on relevance. It was a type question, and if it assists the minister, the number is between 0 and none.
It is disorderly to add extra commentary during the point of order. Order. The minister was talking about the grant process. She was talking about the round, so she is being directly relevant. The Leader of the Nationals, please don't interject while I'm trying to assist the House. I understand that the member would like a specific number or an answer, a bit like the debates we've had about yes-no. As the members know, I don't have the compulsion to deliver that for the member. I do have the compulsion to make sure that the minister is being directly relevant, and she is at the moment.
Mr Speaker, and just for clarity of the House, none isn't a number. I know it took a little while to land, but that was a joke. The laughing should have come straight after I finished.
Order. Members on my left, the Leader of the Nationals, the member for Hume, will just... Order.
She still is.
Order. Just everyone, we're just going to listen to the minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, round one has been announced. We have been working with those councils and states and territories to put in place those contracts now. Round two is now open, and round two is just about to close this week. What we've done on this side of the House is make sure our regional grants programs are transparent. We've heard from councils across the country, over 250 councils that I've met with, that they have spent time and money putting in applications when there were colour-coded spreadsheets available previously that meant that the time and money that they spent putting in grants were not treated fairly. We've heard from councils that they wanted a transparent process, so we've given them one, including a multi-party panel, which members from those opposite and on the crossbench are on, to make sure that our grants process is treated with integrity. And we've seen the ANAO do a report concurrently with Growing Regions to say that it is done with transparency and integrity, which I know is a new concept to some of those opposite. But on this side of the House, we want to treat local councils with dignity and respect. It's one of the reasons that we doubled Roads to Recovery funding, because for a decade those opposites didn't take their local councils seriously when they were asking for additional help with maintenance. They didn't take them seriously when they said they needed additional help with maintenance. On this side of the House, we're delivering not only a doubling of Roads to Recovery, we're delivering them back to the table of National Cabinet, and we're taking their voices seriously because they serve every community across the country.
We'll hear from the member for Dunkley.
My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government's responsible economic management helping to shield the Australian economy from global uncertainty? How is this approach different from others?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Dunkley for her characteristically thoughtful question. Mr Speaker, we are gravely concerned about the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, and we're primarily concerned about the human costs and consequences of that horrible conflict on the other side of the world. But there are also economic consequences. And we're seeing that, I think, most noticeably when it comes to the price of oil on global markets. If you think about the last year or so, Mr Speaker, the global oil price has come down about 11% over the course of the last 12 months, but in the last 10 days it's gone back up 7%. And that gives honourable members a sense of the extreme volatility in that market, which reflects the global uncertainty and volatility more broadly in the global economy. And so if you think about the consequences for us, we have been making really good progress in the fight against inflation. We expect that progress to continue. But it is also the case that some of these global events are putting pressure on prices when Australians are already doing it quite tough. Mr Speaker, this is an important part of the global economic uncertainty, but not the only part. We're also seeing weakness in the Chinese economy. It's one of the reasons why we welcome so enthusiastically the steps that the authorities have announced to support growth and support activity in the Chinese economy. Our forecast for China over the next 3 years, if they happen, will be the slowest 3 years of economic growth in China since it opened up around 40 years ago. And that's why it's so important that the Prime Minister has just wrapped up his meeting with Premier Li of China, because we believe that in that economic relationship, which is full of complexity and full of opportunity, we best represent the workers and businesses and investors of this country when we engage, as the Prime Minister has been doing along with a number of colleagues, with our Chinese counterparts, including myself, a couple of weeks ago. Mr Speaker, in the US, we're seeing data from the US which is causing wild fluctuations in share markets in the US and around the world as well. So there is always a premium on responsible economic management, but especially when the global conditions are as uncertain and as volatile as they are right now. And our responsible economic management has meant that we have halved inflation. We've got real wages growing again. We've got a tax cut for every taxpayer. We've created 1 million jobs in an otherwise soft economy. We've turned 2 big Liberal deficits into 2 big Labor surpluses, and we've avoided $150 billion of Labor debt, of Liberal debt. And that has meant that we can buffer ourselves against global economic uncertainty. We are confident that we can navigate this global uncertainty together, but we are not complacent, because we know that the world is an uncertain place in security terms and economic terms, and that's why responsible economic management is a defining feature of our government.
The call to the member for Calare.
To the Health Minister. Across the Central West, doctors are leaving the bush. From smaller towns like Canowindra, Kandos and Gulgong to larger ones like Wellington and Mudgee, our communities are being left without doctors, and those that remain can't cope. South Mudgee Surgery and now Mudgee Medical Centre have closed their books to new patients. This crisis is a disgrace that will cost lives. When will your government take real and effective action to immediately fix this outrageous crisis and deliver more doctors to Central Western New South Wales and country Australia?
Call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you to the member for that question. I'd be very happy to sit down with him and talk about some of the details of the clinics that he talked about. But if I can say some more general things about the challenge of accessing a GP, particularly in rural and regional Australia, but increasingly in parts of urban Australia as well. As the member knows, there is not the ability to click fingers and suddenly create a whole bunch of new GPs. GPs take a long time to train, and we are steadily working on a plan which is already seeing a greater number of junior doctors take up general practice as their career. The number of junior doctors taking up general practice as their career to train as a specialist GP this year is almost 20% higher than it was last year. We're also bringing in more overseas trained doctors than was the case before COVID. Obviously, COVID was a particular experience. The number of overseas trained doctors and nurses we've brought into the country is about 60% higher than it was in the full year before COVID. We've also put in place a range of incentives that seek to move doctors out of the cities into rural communities. The incentives they are paid are higher than they were before we came to government. A range of other incentives, for example, the Education Minister has put in place help debt or university debt relief for doctors and nurse practitioners who graduate from university and choose a career in rural communities. But I'm not going to pretend to the member or to anyone else in this parliament or across the community that this is going to be fixed overnight. You know, there was a decade of neglect to Medicare and a running down of general practice that had a really serious impact on the culture of general practice. Time and time again, we heard junior doctors saying that they simply didn't feel that general practice was a career that would suit their life, in spite of the fact of there are all sorts of attractions to that specialty compared to the more procedural specialties. We're working with state governments very hard to fix this. When we came to government, there was one pilot, a small pilot in a part of New South Wales, again to try and deal with some of the industrial disincentives to take up general practice as a career. We now have 9 pilots, single employer model pilots, that ensure that GP registrars, as they're doing their several years of training, have a single employer and get all of the industrial benefits, including access to paid parental leave and all the rest that go along with that. We've got a terrific trial that covers the whole of non-urban Tasmania. We have trials rolling out in states on the mainland, including in New South Wales, that slowly but steadily will start to increase the number of GPs coming through the pipeline. This is a really serious challenge. I've tried to be as honest and clear about for my time as Health Minister. I'd be happy to talk to the member about it in more detail.
Move the call to the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Why is it important that the Albanese Labor government acts to ensure schemes like Robodebt never happen again?
Call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lawler for her question. The Robodebt Royal Commission concluded that the former Liberal government's Robodebt scheme was a crude and cruel mechanism, neither fair nor legal. This illegal scheme resulted in hundreds of thousands of Australians being served with wrongful debt notices. The Royal Commissioner, Catherine Holmes, ACSC, stated that Robodebt made many people feel like criminals. In essence, people were traumatised. On the off chance that they might owe money, it was a costly failure of public administration in both human and economic terms. And with those words, the Royal Commission summed up the human tragedy that was the Robodebt scheme, introduced by the Abbott government, expanded by the Turnbull government and defended right up to the last minute by the Morrison government. Despite warnings as early as 2017, the Royal Commission found that the path taken by the former government was to double down, to go on the attack in the media against those who complained and to maintain the falsehood that in fact the system had not changed at all. And while, of course, ministers of the former government bear the ultimate responsibility for the Robodebt scheme, the Royal Commission found serious failings with the institutional checks and balances that could have put a stop to the Robodebt scheme long before the federal court found that it was unlawful. The Royal Commission made it clear that it could have been stopped if there had been strong and effective oversight. And today I've introduced legislation that will implement key recommendations of the Robodebt Royal Commission to ensure that Commonwealth agencies are subject to stronger and more rigorous oversight. The legislation recognises the importance of ensuring the Ombudsman has the necessary legislative powers to undertake full, independent and transparent investigations. The public has to be confident that government agencies are acting with integrity and accountability. This legislation boosts the powers and capability of oversight bodies to ensure that government bodies are accountable. But I have to say, Mr Speaker, while this is vital and useful legislation that I have introduced today, the best way to ensure that an illegal scheme like the robo-debt scheme never happens again is never to elect a Liberal government.
Give the call to the member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Is it appropriate during a cost of living crisis, when Australian families cannot afford to pay their power and grocery bills, that the Australian Ambassador to the United States, Mr Kevin Rudd, has spent $90,000 on an alcohol-fuelled celebration of drag queen DJ Kitty Glitter?
Give the call to the Acting Prime Minister. Order.
I thank the member for her question. Kevin Rudd is doing a remarkable job as Australia's ambassador to the United States. And there will be members on the other side who have visited the United States during his time as the ambassador who will absolutely privately attest to that. Kevin has been a tour de force, as we all understand, in the United States Congress in a way which has created a generational change, for example, in establishing a seamless defence industrial base between our two countries, something that has been sought to be achieved for decades. It is his work, principally, in the United States Congress and across the administration, which has brought that to fruition. His activities as the ambassador to the United States are entirely consistent with previous ambassadors. We could all go through the process of crawling through the expenses of former ambassadors to the United States. But the fact of the matter is that Kevin Rudd is there not just representing the government, he is representing us all, and he is doing an excellent job. And while he is doing that in the United States, while he is carrying the weight of our country in Washington, what we are doing here is addressing the cost of living pressures that are facing the Australian people. And by and large, as we go about the business of doing that, we do it faced with the opposition of those opposite. I mean, when we seek to provide tax breaks for every income earner, it's those opposite who are kicking up a storm in relation to that, albeit that at the end of the day they vote for it. When we have taken measures to provide for energy rebates, when we have gone down the path of providing more affordable childcare, cheaper medicines, it is those opposite who stand in the way of meaningful action in respect of dealing with the cost of living pressures that are faced by the Australian people. So we will go about our business of dealing with cost of living pressures for the Australian people. Kevin Rudd is going about his business of representing everybody in this chamber and in this country in Washington DC, and in that effort he is doing a sterling job.
Call to the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering cheap electricity? How does this compare to more expensive energy policies?
Great question. No. The Minister is going to resume his seat. The member for Grey has been here long enough and has been through enough question times to know yelling out during a question is highly disorderly. Just want to remind all members the supremacy of members being able to ask a question in silence. I'm not sure how many times I have to remind everyone. So the member for Grey is warned, and out of respect for the member for Hunter, he's going to ask his question again. Member for Hunter has the question.
Thank you again, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering cheaper electricity? How does this compare to more expensive energy policies?
Call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Hunter for his question. And as the member knows, the Albanese government's delivering cheaper energy by energy bill relief in the short term and by more renewable energy in the longer term, Mr. Speaker. And that's reflected in the fact I'm going to get to you in a minute. I just calm down. That's reflected in the fact that the last inflation figures showed energy prices falling by 17.9% in the year, which followed a 5.1% fall and was described as the largest annual fall for electricity on record, Mr. Speaker. Something you'd think every member would be pleased about. Now, that is partly due to the Albanese government's energy bill relief, but we've had an alternative policy from the opposition. We had an interview yesterday from our old friend, the Shadow Minister for Finance. We always look forward to those interviews. She's one of the more transparent members of the opposition. She always says what she's thinking, and she said subsidies for energy have never been coalition policy, Mr. Speaker. So the opposition is against a 17.9% drop in electricity prices that were brought about by energy bill relief. Now, the member for Hunter also asked me about more expensive alternatives. And of course, the Leader of the Opposition wants to introduce the most expensive form of energy available, nuclear energy. And there have been, as I said the other day, developments since we last sat. The Leader of the Opposition gave a big speech called Nuclear Power in Australia. Could it work? Now, based on the substance and detail in that speech, the answer is not sure, really. Don't really know, because the speech was a great big nothing burger. It was a great big fizzer, Mr. Speaker. No data, no detail. Now, this comes, Mr. Speaker, as report after report shows that the opposition's plan will put energy prices up. Professor Rod Sims said maybe $200 a year. Dr Dylan McConnell said $400 or $500 a year. Dr Roger Dargaville said $1,000 a year. And, of course, we've also seen the report from IEFA which said $665 a year on average. Now, Mr. Speaker, this comes more than a year after the member for Fairfax said on Q&A, and I'll quote him, "We are doing the modelling right now, based on actual data, And he went on to say, we're the ones formulating the policy. We've got the data based on real data, based on Hitachi, Westinghouse and NuScale. Now, I understand the concerns of the member for Fairfax because NuScale was then cancelled because it reached $9 billion for one reactor. Now, do you notice that the opposition doesn't really like talking about their own policies? Q&A invited him and I on for a debate. I said yes. He said no, Mr. Speaker. He said no. But they're going to get a chance. The Parliament has resolved a parliamentary inquiry into nuclear energy, chaired by our friend the member for Hunter, is going to do an excellent job getting these issues on the table in regions and communities right around Australia, and we can't wait for that detail to come out, Mr. Speaker.
Call to the honourable member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. Is it appropriate during a cost of living crisis, when Australian families cannot afford to pay their power and grocery bills, that the Australian Research Council has approved research grants for projects including challenging the protectionist myth that Australia is an island girt by sea, investigating whether the English translation of Greek tragedies have any gender bias, and exploring musical approaches to advancing multi-species justice? Can the minister confirm that these projects received over $4 million of taxpayers' money?
Order. Order. Members, When the House comes to order, we'll hear from the Minister for Education.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 10 years, the ARC has been bedevilled by political interference. And I have ended that. By getting politicians out of the decision-making process.
Order.
You shouldn't ask questions you don't know the answer to, Pete.
Order.
Because it just happened to be the former head of the Prime Minister's department under you. Oh, he's a joke, is he? He's a joke now, is he? Right. Peter Shergold is a joke, is that right? Is that right? You want to apologise to him at the dispatch box now?
Order. I'll give the call to the Leader of the Opposition. The minister needs to direct his comments through the chair. This is not a back and forth across the chamber. You are answering a question. Order. The Minister for Social Services is warned. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. If leave's been granted, I'm very happy to add to this question. And the point that I would make, Mr Speaker, the point that I'd make is that this is outrageous spending.
Resume your seat. No. Order. 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 The House is going to come to order immediately. This is not an appropriate way to behave. The Minister is going to answer the question. He will not take interjections from the Leader of the Opposition, and the Leader of the Opposition will not give the interjections. I'm just going to ask the Minister to return to the question.
Couldn't help himself, could he, Mr Speaker? More aggro than Cartoon Connection. More aggro than Cartoon Connection.
Order. The Minister.
Mr Speaker, all ARC project.
The Minister will pause. I've already cautioned the Minister. He has one more chance to return to the question. I don't want any more commentary about the opposition. I want him to return straight to the question, or he'll be sat down. The Minister has the call.
All ARC project funding applications are subject to a competitive process informed by peer review with recommendations made by experts. That peer review is accepted world standard for achieving quality in research grant outcomes. Mr Speaker, the ARC is not the political plaything of the Liberal Party. I'm actually surprised that the member for Sturt would ask this question, given that when this was debated in the parliament a couple of months ago, he didn't even bother to participate in the debate.
Order. Order. Members on my right are going to cease interjecting. The member for Spence will cease interjecting. The member for Moreton is warned. I'd like to hear from the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. How are the Albanese Labor government's cost of living measure strengthening the Australian economy, and what is standing in the way?
The call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. The simple fact is that when this government came to office, we inherited from those opposite an economic shambles. A Liberal government, no less, had delivered $1 trillion of debt with nothing to show for it. Headline inflation was at 6.1%. Interest rates were starting to rise. The budget was in a complete mess. In areas such as defence and in infrastructure, we saw billions of dollars of commitments without a dollar behind them. Now, through the leadership of the Treasurer and the Finance Minister, over the last 2.5 years, we have methodically worked to put the budget back into order. And since we were last here in September, the government has officially booked its second surplus. A Labor government in power for 2 years, 2 surpluses, something those opposite never did, despite promising that they would do it each and every year. And since we were last here, we have learnt that inflation now is at 2.7%. Less than half of what we inherited from those opposite. Now, we understand that Australians are doing it tough. As I said earlier, there is inflation impacting countries around the world. We're not immune from that. And the best thing we can do is to wage a war on inflation, which is what we're doing, and we are now succeeding on that. And where we are spending money, we are focused on the cost of living, tax cuts for every income earner. Energy rebates. We have seen more affordable childcare, cheaper medicines, and all the while we've actually seen record investments in defence. This government is utterly focused on the basics of prudent economic management and sensible national security on Middle Australia. But, Mr Speaker, those opposite are not so much interested in Middle Australia as they are in the Middle East. We've seen during the course of this week, really over the course of the last few months, questions that have been asked on visas, questions which have sought to undermine the confidence of our national security agencies, questions which are about trying to create a faux divide on foreign policy which simply does not exist. And they are doing all of this so that they do not have to speak about the economy, because this bunch of Liberals have foregone any claim to credible economic management, to sensible national security policy. They could not be further from their historic mission. Well, as we leave here today, you can count on the fact that the Liberals will continue to be the party of division, of distraction, of rank politics. But on this side of the House, there is a government which is committed to focusing on Australians, on their personal budgets, on their households, on their lives. And with that, Mr Speaker, I ask the further question.